I'm Cheryl Rose with Social Innovation Generation at the University of Waterloo, and I'm here with Dr. Jane Barratt this afternoon, Secretary General of the International Federation of Aging. So Jane, thanks a lot for giving us some time.
It's my great pleasure.
And we're just going to have a bit of a conversation so that we can frame this issue a little bit, and you can share some of your expertise. And so, you know, this is this big issue, aging, which I know that you have all kinds of ideas about, even just thinking about it in this block or this, you know, sort of umbrella term. And that may be one of the challenges that you see, the way we look at this issue itself. But what do you see as some of the major challenges around the issue in different parts of the system that are causing us to remain stuck in old ways of thinking and not helping us to move forward in ways that you think are of more positive impact?
That's a good question, Cheryl. I think we've got to start off by saying that, you know, there are three demographic upheavals that are happening globally. One of them is population ageing, one of them is globalisation, and one's urbanisation. And each of these global drivers is helping to shape our understanding of people growing older in a number of different societies. So if we park that over there and then just take that population ageing and put it on the table, we have a lot of misconceptions about ageing, and I think probably because none of us want to grow old and die. So we actually make up stories about growing older. The truth is that we start ageing from birth, and throughout the life course, you know, we are older relative to, you know, the generations that are coming through. So that's the first thing, because I often hear people saying the older people when they themselves are chronologically in the third phase of their life, you know, the old, as we would say it. So ageing starts at birth. We talk about a life course approach to ageing. So there are a number of different transitions that we will go through in our life course. But when we come to talk about policies and programs and legislation, governments tend to look at the end that we call the burden of growing older, the burden of care. How do we fix this? And by doing that, I think generally we have this language that starts developing in our society, and I'll give you some examples that really irritate me, like there's the demographic tsunami. So when I think of those words, literally, it is this wave of older people that's going to be a great threat to society, that are going to overtake, that we're going to need to address in some dramatic way. And in fact, we've known about what's happening to our population in terms of it growing older for decades. So we talk about developed countries. So for example, European countries have grown richer before they've grown older, whereas less developed countries like China, India, are growing older before they become richer. So in terms of population ageing, I think about the numbers of people and the acceleration of a country's age. So Japan, for example, is the oldest country in the world because of the number of people with a life expectancy that is beyond late 80s into their 90s.
Wow.
So Japan is known for as a country that has the largest number of centenarians, which right now is about 40,000 centenarians. We also know that India will overtake China as the most populated country in the world in the next 10 years. And the numbers of older people in China, 65 and over, is about 153 million now. And that will likely double in the next 30 years. So some countries are ageing slower than others. So for example, if we look at the sub-Saharan region, we're confronted with the HIV epidemic, the non-communicable diseases that really have shortened the life expectancy of men and women. So generally the average life expectancy of a male in Sierra Leone is about 37. But then we also need to look at Indigenous populations. And from the country that I come from, Australia, our Indigenous population, in terms of life expectancy, is almost 20 years less than non-Indigenous Australians. And so we need to look at ageing through the cultural lens and also the gender lens, because women, as we know, generally live longer than men. So there's a number of different slices when we talk about population ageing. As we said before, as I said to you before, it's not a linear phenomenon, but it's a multi-dimensional manifestation.
Are there other things that you think keep us from really understanding and thinking creatively and positively about the issue of aging in our populations?
Look, I think if we look at how we live and work with older people in our community, you know, we talk about the grassroots movements, and the grassroots movements about listening to the rights of people of all ages and all generations. And when we think about older people, you know, there's a big question around the world as to whether the rights of older people are being protected. And when we look at protection, I mean in the very broadest sense. So, does a woman of 70 years of age in industrialised countries have the right to a mammogram? You know, do men in their 80s have the right to certain surgical procedures, or are we couching our decisions as health professionals in terms of a discriminating language? And so all of these issues around rights are really coming to the fore now, you know, in a dialogue with the United Nations around whether we need a new international instrument to protect rights. So I'll put that one over to that side, because that's a really prickly issue for many member states when we come to talk about rights. I think generally, I've said that, you know, we're talking often about burden of care. Just over the last 5 to 10 years, I think there's been a real shift in trying to understand older people in the workplace. You know, the need for older people to remain in employment versus retirement. And I think the stats in Canada, about 40% of all public servants can retire in 2011. Now, the average retirement age is 58.4. And if you look at life expectancy, that's probably another 25 years on. So what do these people do? Now, we talk about volunteerism, and we talk about second careers and third careers, and then we need to have a look at industry and say, is industry ready to develop flexible work arrangements, and does industry need the older worker in their midst? And the answer is yes, they do need them, because we've had a low fertility rate, and so we really need older people to remain in the workforce. And the second thing is, are they ready? Not generally, no. Because I think the generation, don't know about you, but I started my first job at 14 years of age, and I got, for 3.5 hours work, this will date me, $14.86, right, for 3.5 hours work. Now, the generation that's coming after us want flexible work arrangements. You know, my son of 30 only wants to work 3 days a week, not keen on working 5 days a week. So work arrangements look very different now. So industry, you know, they need to be in a position of readiness to embrace the changes of older workers. I think the other aspect is this whole notion about active ageing, and what does that mean? And I'm not quite sure. It means many different things to different people. I think one of the facts that is not often reported is about 1 in 7 people over the age of 75 will ever require any institutional care, any residential care. So then I ask the question, where are the other 6? So the other 6, perhaps 3 out of the 6 are actually quite independent into their 80s and 90s. and they're remaining at home with little or no assistance. And then you've got another 3 that require some assistance from flexible, innovative models of home care. So we need to understand, if we had a finite bucket of money, where would we start putting some investments?
So you've talked about industry needing to prepare better for an aging workforce who may have different needs, different priorities, different perspectives on work. And now you're talking about sort of the formal care system. So do you feel that they're ready for these different flexible arrangements, or is there still a lot of work to be done there as well?
There's a lot of work to be done. There's some great champions out there, great champions. So BMO are doing some very interesting work around caregiving. Home Depot are also doing some very interesting work. They're recognising that an effective workforce is a workforce that has the flexibility for emergency situations, has the flexible work hours to respond to different social roles that they have. So there's 2 companies that certainly we can learn from. I think the other really interesting area that's coming out of the UK is an organisation called Employers for Care. Now, there's probably about 15 companies chaired by British Telecom, and their organisational purpose is to support other companies to understand the role of family caregiving. And in doing so, enable their workforce to remain in the workforce as well as manage the demanding role of family caregiving. Now that is real benchmark stuff that we need to be looking at. So the industry has stepped up, you know, there's government that has some legislative pieces in place, and you have civil society. So it's very much a tripartite arrangement in influencing policy and practice.
Yeah. So now you're talking about all different parts of the system working at things. Do you see, so we're beginning to talk about some examples that are exciting, hopeful, some examples of innovation within the system. Do you see other examples that you feel excited about? And do you see anywhere parts of the system are coming together to work? That they're crossing across those, you know, invisible but sometimes pretty real barriers that are between private, public, and the social and community sector and citizens generally speaking. Do you see some examples of the system coming together with new ideas, and also do you see pockets within different sectors in the system?
I think to answer the first question, I'm beginning to understand we need to step outside the whole issue of ageing to actually look at what is the glue that brings these pieces together. Right? So if we take the topic of family caregiving for a minute, you know, it wasn't family caregiving that gave BT the purpose to do something. BT, British Telecom, was interested in maintaining a productive workforce. They were interested in that because they don't have the labour market to actually grow their business. So because of that, they needed to understand why was there attrition? You know, was it mandatory retirement? Was there discrimination in the workplace? Was there flexible work arrangements? There was family caregiving issues. And so through understanding the productivity of a company, they understood what was preventing them from growing. And I think by stepping back on some issues, I think we can then look at it through a different set of eyes. I think if we look at, for example, the issue of 800,000 people with dementia in Canada, if we focus on that issue of what are we going to do with these people, then the answer is not there. You know, we need to step back and what do we need to do? Do we want to enable families to support their loved ones at home? Do we want to understand what active ageing for someone with dementia looks like? Then what does a facility that's purpose-built for people with dementia look like? So we've actually got to ask the question and then create the solution. And then we've got different sectors coming together. So it's not being direct, going into the problem. That's what I'm saying.
examples that you see in government that you feel are kind of trying to get at innovative new ways of thinking about this? Do you see anything, especially with your global contacts? Are there places in the world that you feel are really at least open to tackling some of the things that get in the way?
Yeah, look, I think there's some really interesting projects in Canada that spark my interest because they've tackled what could be a problem issue by bringing stakeholders together. Now that's all language that's not necessary. Let me describe it. The intergenerational project called Age Strong, right? This is a project with students and older people, and it's about discrimination. So, you know, a community project that brings these two quite different populations together and says, we see that this is an issue, discrimination, which then moves on to abusive situations potentially. So what do we do? So the development of a video, the hip hop video, you know, has created enormous interest. And it's not because it's focused on discrimination, but it's because you have generations working together to understand a particular issue. So it's about bringing the ends together, you know, to produce something. So I'll give you another couple of examples. I think the work in Austria is interesting in terms of social contracts. So Austria, Denmark are well known for looking at the social contracts between generations and across generations. And so instead of having an aged care policy or a seniors policy, you know, it's an intergenerational policy, you know, which tries to understand this life transition piece. And I think that in many countries we're still, you know, quite stuck, you know, on the children, the youth, the seniors. So we're really carving the populations up instead of looking at what is the transition piece that we need to be looking at to understand how we can support people of all generations, but also those in the most vulnerable state or in a state of great productivity. You know, keeping in mind that our population is much healthier than what it was 20 or 30 years ago. I think one of the other very vexed issues for government is around financial protection. You know, we have older people that are going to live longer, so therefore what is our state system going to be able to do to support these older people? And that's a very good reason for older people to be encouraged to stay in work. There's a great resistance to that in some countries, as we saw in France last year. You know, there was 1 million people that marched in September last year, you know, against a decrease in the retirement age. Decrease? Increase? Increase.
Against an increase.
Yeah, against an increase. But in November, legislation passed. So the retirement age is now 62 instead of 60. So one of the reasons for that is that governments across Europe, because their populations have aged faster than those less developed countries, you know, they don't have, you know, the necessary financial protection in some of those countries. Because we're still, there's the remnants of the social legislation of Bismarck in 1883 is still with us. So, you know, we're well over 100 years on, and we still in some countries talk about this notional 60, 65, 70.
So why do you think that is? Why are we stuck there?
Well, you know, it takes much more than political will to create change, you know, in some of the systems that have been developed. In all countries, our systems are rigid in terms of change.
Yeah.
So we don't have the good fortune of starting off with a white sheet of paper. No government does. So when we have, you know, the government, a new government come in, the first thing that they will say is, well, the previous government did this wrong and we're going to try and fix it up. So it's almost as if we're trying to fix it up round the edges, because to make radical changes, you know, in something like our health and social care system would mean dramatic changes in the way that we think about growing older, also our staff resident ratios. It would challenge us in terms of our incentive models of care, because now the more dependent someone is, the more money that we get. So my question would be, so then why are we doing anything for anyone if we're going to get more money if someone's more dependent? And so it's very challenging, you know, to put forward, as Hong Kong has, a new model where the incentives are for people that improve in function versus deteriorate in function. So, you know, the way that we can do this is certainly through demonstration projects, but a commitment that there will be core funding. One of the other challenges in Canada is that we don't, in our field, in the field of ageing, we don't have national strategies. We don't have national frameworks. So the jurisdictional responsibility lies with the provinces. And so...
So can you talk a little bit more about why that's a challenge for a country like Canada?
Yeah. Look, look, it's a tremendous challenge. Put very simply, if I required care in a facility, and I'll use the word nursing home, but that's an old word too, because you know, there's a lot more things that happen rather than nursing.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to throw that one out. If I required nursing care in Ontario and then I moved to Prince Edward Island, the care would be completely different. We don't have national standards, and so I can't be guaranteed the same drugs from one province to the next. I can't be guaranteed the same standard of care from one province to the next.
So, for example, you know, kind of linking this to the family care issue, if, for example, you had to move to be closer to family so that you would have more care, you might find yourself in a completely different environment.
Totally different environment, because the programs that are in this province are not duplicated anywhere in Canada. So we don't have exactly the same, we don't have even near the same.
Yeah.
And so the demands are going to be quite different. So comparative studies to develop good evidence across Canada are very difficult to come by, because it's like comparing apples and potatoes.
So what do you would see as some of the advantages of having a national strategy around aging for Canada?
Yeah, look, the clear advantage from the eyes that I look at Canada through is equity. You know, we're a country that prides ourselves on equity. You know, this is what internationally Canada is known for. And so my question would be, you know, if that's what we pride ourselves on, then why can't this happen? Why can't provinces come together and actually agree that there are minimum standards across the board for home care providers, that all home care providers are licensed to a particular standard, you know, that there are flexible models of staffing, because in some provinces there is no flexible staff model. So for X number of residents you have X number of staff and X kinds of staff. Now that doesn't give a provider the flexibility to actually support people who have greater needs, greater functional deficits. So, you know, if we were to have a national system, there would be commitment, there would have to be commitment from all the provinces that older people are valued and productive, and from time to time, and in many cases as we grow older, you know, they will have a standard of care that we're proud of nationally. And families will have a reassurance that they don't have now. And staff, perhaps the careers of care workers will actually be considered as something sought after rather than something that you have to do.
So, you know, a lot of the comments that are coming up as we talk about each of these different facets, Jane, seem to me to come back often to kind of a perspective. You know, what do we think is true about this? What are the stories we tell ourselves about getting old and about aging, about living with older people around us in our work, in our homes, in our communities? And it sounds to me like you're identifying one of the major challenges, just our culture around that, and what we believe to be true, the language we use. You talk about how nursing home doesn't fit anymore, and you know, our idea about retirement, what that means, what's worth fighting for, what makes sense. So if you think about that particular challenge, I don't know if you could talk a little bit about what you would imagine might be some new ways, some goals of getting people to think about things differently. What are some new perspectives that either you imagine or you see others working towards that you think this is important to start finding a way for this to be a new story about aging? Are there ways of thinking about it, approaches to it, perspectives that you feel are important that are missing right now?
I think, look, one of the keys that you've mentioned, I've talked about, is language. And I think that by industry committed to using different language will actually change the tone of the conversation. So in this country we referred to older people as seniors. And you know, some of my colleagues refer to a certain bracket of the seniors as Zoomers, and then we've got the Boomers, then we've got, so you know, we're labelling people because it's sometimes it's good marketing, but it categorises, you know, a group of people. If we could start with a language that said, you know, older people, you know, so it's a neutral language. It doesn't automatically colour the way. So, you know, to address ageism and stigma around growing older, you know, engaging with media in different ways. And so the abuse story doesn't hit the headlines, you know, on 2 days because it's an abuse story. And I think that we haven't done well in understanding how to work with media and also understanding how to work with government and decision makers. You know, we're really asking government to come up with solutions and fix it, when I believe that there could be much more of a community responsibility into developing new ideologies around growing older as a community. I think one of the lessons that could be valuable is looking at the different cultures, you know, in Canada, across Canada. And Ontario is a tremendous example. You know, it is quite a mosaic of different groups, interrelated, but valuing their own culture. And the great example is, you know, how the Chinese community view health and wellness versus, you know, some European, you know, some Australian. The way that they view it and talk about it is quite different. And yet we tend not to embrace and try and understand that. You know, we actually are locked in, you know, what our perceptions are. So if there was there are some bright horizons, bright points on the horizons, and it's around Canada being a leader in the whole area of ethnocultural diversity. You know, we can and should be leading this whole area in terms of ageing in a foreign land, what it is to be older and supporting your family, what it is to be older, culturally diverse and productive in this world. The other area is around the notion of volunteerism and what that's going to look like in the future. And I'm not sure that I want to be a volunteer. What I want to be is I want to be a mentor, I want to do pro bono work, but I don't want to be a volunteer, because that word resonates in a different era for some people. And so we need to think about taking traditional perspectives in a contemporary society. So if we need to throw out social legislation or need to address it front on, let's put it on the table. Because I think sometimes it's almost like the smoke and mirrors, that we're actually fighting something that we just don't know that we're fighting. And so in terms of moving forward, the areas that show great promise are around the workforce. We need older people in the workforce. How are we going to make that happen? You know, the tripartite relationship of civil society. Where is civil society in Canada? Where are the voices of older people? We don't have a strong civil society in Canada. Why not? You know, is it something to do with the culture of Canadians? I'm not sure. You know, the whole area of financial protection. You know, how are we going to develop new models? And is that linked to our industry and flexible work arrangements? Then you've got the whole area of family caregiving, the care model. So you can look at this almost on a continuum and then build almost like a rubric cube. So if you can visualise a rubric cube, I often think about if you put a tag on each one of the squares. So for example, you've got retirement, housing, long-term care, and you pushed one, then another one would come back at you because it's not linear, it's multi-dimensional. So as soon as you push one button, another button will come back. The other area I wanted to touch on, which is really important, is around environment. Now, in Canada was one of the leaders in the development of the domains for age-friendliness, age-friendly communities, age-friendly cities. And by the way, Canada was one of the leaders in the development of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Ageing. You know, it's the second United Nations plan that's committed to the rights of older people in 3 different domains: older people in development, advancing health and well-being, and ensuring enabling supportive environments. Now this whole environmental piece, many people sort of look at the concrete. You know, they look at the accessible doors, you know, the curbs, etc. You know, we need to go much broader than this, you know, and think about things like communication and technology, dignity and respect. So the domains that WHO, the World Health Organization, you know, have identified need to be drilled down, because it's almost as if that's the meat of the skeleton that we have. So if you think about you know, age policy, seniors policy as a skeleton, then what's the meat that actually makes it actually come alive and be dynamic and work properly? So if we think about environment, things that come to mind for me is why do we have an increase in depressive illnesses, mental health disturbances, you know, in the older age group? And certainly there's the whole group of conditions, dementias, but we also have a group of conditions that are predisposed because of isolation and marginalisation. Right?
Yeah.
Why? Because, and this is very generalisation, but you know, family have moved away. You know, the husband has died. You know, the mother of 80 is living in a rural and remote community. There's no transportation, the communication is poor, etc. So the environmental conditions do not enable her to be part of community. So, and that's everybody's responsibility. You know, once upon a time, you know, I had a neighbourhood. I grew up in a neighbourhood and I knew the neighbourhood. And now we don't have that so much. So how has society contributed to the issues around stigmatisation and ageism related to growing older. So the environment is a real new area that we don't understand. Urbanisation, another area we don't understand in relation to population ageing. So we know every 1% increase in the urbanisation in China, 10 million more people move to a city. So we have those figures, but in terms of the essence of the community, what does that really mean for us?
Yeah.